to talk about something that's deeply personal. And it's not something that I have talked about on stage, which is why we are calling it the first time. If I bolt out of here in tears, then you're going to know where I'm coming from. But just before that, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit because this is going to give context to the journey that I take you on. So I'm Tania Ngima, or like my mother likes to say, she's like, you're Tania who? You're called Ngima. So I'm Tania Ngima. I am a strategy and finance specialist. I also serve on the boards of a couple of companies in the SME space, in the financial services industry in Kenya and South Africa. One of them, which you might know, Resolution Insurance. I also serve on the board of Demo Ventures, Savi VC in South Africa, and Profectus, which is a boutique investment firm in Kenya. Now, here comes the most difficult part. So 7 years ago, my marriage failed. And when something like that happens to you, you go through a couple of things. And the first thing you feel is an overwhelming sense of loss. What follows in close succession is not knowing who you are. Because for a part of your life, you were a partner with someone. That was your identity. That was how you defined yourself. You molded yourself to fit into a life with this other person and to be the best partner that you could be. And then suddenly you feel rudderless and like you don't have a direction. And the worst thing is that when you look at yourself in the mirror sometimes, you feel like you're less than. You feel like your sense of self-worth has been downgraded a little bit. And it doesn't matter what circumstances led to your marriage breaking down, you're always going to feel like there's something missing. And it's such an insidious feeling that when something like this happens, something that was such a part of your life, it could actually make you feel like you're a failure in all the other areas of your life, especially if it was the one thing that grounded you and the one thing that you defined yourself by. You start thinking about the dreams that you had in this relationship that you were in, or in this marriage that you were in. You wanted to be a mother, and you wanted to bring your children into this union. You wanted to do amazing things. I'm going to tell you guys about something my friends and I do. We have something we call the dream funeral. And I don't know whether there's anyone who's got experience of it. I know she's laughing. It's a very woo-woo thing, but it's one of those things where whether it's a relationship, a job, any significant event in your life, when it ends, me and my friends, we have a dream funeral. We don't burn sage, but sometimes we write letters and we burn them. So the dream funeral is to mourn all the things that you had expected to experience with either this person or in this role or in this job. And we did that. And usually when we do that, like for example, for opportunities that have failed or for jobs that we walked away from, when we wake up the next morning, you feel so much more wholesome and like you can conquer the world. When we did the dream funeral with my best friend and one other person, when I woke up the next morning, I felt even more shattered than I was before we did the dream funeral. Because who am I now? Who am I now as this person who's not Mrs. So-and-so? And then, of course, we live in a society that glamorizes keeping things. Keeping a job, keeping a man. I don't know whether they tell men this. I don't know whether you're told about keeping a woman, keeping a marriage. In fact, keeping a marriage going is usually cited as the sole responsibility sometimes of the woman. And it's just because of how we are culturally and what our responsibility is seen as when we are in a union. But this conversation that I want to have is not so much about my failed marriage, but it's about who I became after that and the journey that I went through. So yes, I'm in this space where my marriage has failed. I'm not Mrs. Someone. I wanted to have children. We've had a dream funeral. We've acknowledged that there's certain things that are not going to come to life in the context that I had expected them to. But on the other hand, I'm also a woman for who success is very much interlinked to what I do. So professionally, being a strategy and finance specialist, I was on an upward trajectory in my career. I was on director level positions. But because of what happened, I decided to take a break. So I went to the UK to do my MBA. So this is the thing, because I hadn't had this conversation when I told most people that I was going to go to the UK for 1 year to do my MBA. Most people would ask, what about your husband? And it's so difficult because you're not ready to have that conversation. So you say, no, I'll be visiting, he'll be visiting, because you're not ready yet to say that you don't have a marriage to speak of anymore. And so I went to the UK and then I came back. So the other thing that I used to hold strongly onto was my career. It was unshakable, it was solid. Okay, fine, I've taken a sabbatical for 1 year, I've gone to the UK, and then I come back. And then I got a position out of the country and I went away. Then after about a year, I came back and I decided I'm done with finance. So for those of you who have experience with finance, what we do is we work like crazy. Every 1 week out of every month, you're spending nights in the office because you've got management reports and you've got to send reports to shareholders and directors. And then out of every 3 months, at least for 2 weeks, you're sleeping in the office because you've got board packs for the board meetings, etc. And I just realized that I can't live that life. Something I might have omitted was that I had a newborn at the time. So it wasn't the environment to raise a child. So now I'm going into the place where I'm saying, I'm quitting this job. So I took 1 year to raise my son. So I'm quitting this job. And then what? Because I was on maternity leave. And then I took about 6 additional months off. And when it came to going back to Uganda, that was where the position was at the time, about 3 days I wrote my resignation letter. And I hadn't thought it through. Those risk-averse people who used to say, I would rather sleep in the office every day and work for an organization as long as I'm not fully responsible for that money I'm looking for. I'm not the person who goes out to look for business and to do sales, etc. I'm not that person. And that's a limiting belief. It's a story that I had told myself for a really long time, right? Completely risk-averse. I mean, finance, I was as finance as you could be. So then I have a young child, and I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow, so what do I do now? The fortunate thing was I'm really good with money, so I'd saved up, so I could afford to be out of the work environment for about a year without having to worry about, and you know, those first couple of years for kids, what are you buying? You're buying diapers and formula milk. There's really not too much. When they start to go to school, then you've got to start thinking about what you're going to do. And during that process, there's a couple of things that I had to do. I had to redefine my relationship with failure, with fear, and with success. So because of the society that we are brought up in, and just because we live in a capitalistic environment, success is the material things. It's the cars we drive, where we live, the property we own, the investments we have, etc. And in one fell swoop, I had given up all that. So what is success for me now? Now that I don't have the high-flying career, who am I? Remember, I had to give up a part of my identity when my marriage failed. But who am I now that I don't have a career to fall back on? Now that I can't say I am finance director of this organization. And what it made me do is it made me go back and get very into the psychology of what fear is. So if you have any interest in this area, you'll know that our bodies have evolved over time significantly. So right from, you know, thousands and thousands of years ago, when we had the dinosaurs and, you know, when we had the Homo sapiens and we evolved, but our prehistoric brain hasn't done such a good job. So what happens is we have this thing, it's called the fear center in our brains, it's called the amygdala. And right now today, when you think about coming on stage, the physiological response that your body has, the sweaty hands, it's the fight or flight response, is exactly what you'd have had back then when you came out of your cave and you were face to face with a lion. It's exactly the same way your body responds. We haven't evolved in that sense. And I had to understand that the things that I was afraid of were not necessarily things to be afraid of. They were more to be viewed as challenges. So one of them was deciding to stand on my own 2 feet, to not be employed, and to figure out what I was going to do and to build my brand. And let me tell you guys, there was a 2-year period where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I would wonder, what the hell did I do? Like, what was I thinking? Like, am I crazy? Like, what is wrong with me? And I didn't have people around me to have these conversations with who would tell me, yes, you're going to go through this really crazy periods of time where you're going to have self-doubt, but you're going to come out the other side having figured it out. We also see that it's very difficult to be able to connect the dots backwards. So you've got to go through this journey to be able to see that every experience and every conversation and everything that you went through existed to bring you to this point. But for 2 years, I didn't have that. And it was a constant process and vicious cycle filled with self-doubt and filled with, okay, so my marriage failed, so I'm also going to fail as a professional, and then I'm going to be nothing, and I'm one of those people who puts a very high premium on what my brand is, how people perceive me, which is the wrong way to look about success. When you're redefining success, you can't afford for success to be how people see you. It's got to come from within. And I really went through that journey in a really, really messy and difficult way. So during the day, I would wear this facade for my son because I understood that the things that I felt would transmute to him. So I had to wear this facade of this happy person and teach him the things that I want to teach him. And at night, I would crash and I would be despondent, and I'd be online Googling failure and success, and how do you know you're a failure, and all these things. So it was just a reinforcement of what society perceives success to be and failure to be. One of the lessons that I learned was that success changes as you evolve and as you grow. So right now, my son is 4.5. For me, success is being able to be present for him and to be the kind of parent that I want to be. In a different season, thank you. In a different season of my life, success is probably going to be something else. If I do get married again, success is probably going to have a different definition and a different look. But one of the most insidious and difficult things to do in society is to say that I am a misnomer, I'm going to be a nonconformist, and I'm going to define success for myself as opposed to how society sees success representing in the material possessions, etc. So what my intelligent brain was telling me, and what me being defined as an intelligent person was telling me, was you can't afford to fail, because I've gotten so comfortable with being called intelligent that if I fail, I'm going to lose that label, and then who am I going to be? I want this conversation to be less about the other person and what transpired in my marriage for me to realize that it was over, and I want it to be more about what I learned. So when people ask me, what happened and what part did I play in my marriage failing? I realized, I think 3 years after my marriage had failed, that for me, independence, how I interpreted it, was invulnerability. Because independence says you've got your own money, you can do your own thing, you can make your own decisions, you don't need to lean on anyone. That's what I thought it meant. It's actually not what it means. So what it also translated to in my brain was that I can't afford to be vulnerable to anyone. When I was growing up, I saw people around me open themselves up and get disappointed over and over and over, whether it was by their family or by their friends. And me, the independent woman, I was like, it's never gonna happen to me. So I've just got to have my act together. It was a really damaging thing. And I know I talk about it now in a very flippant manner, in a very easy way, but I learned the hard way. So one of the things I had to do was, about 4 years after we had the dream funeral, I had to have another one with my friends with lots of tears, and we had to sit and we had to figure out what part did I have to play. And in vulnerability, in fact, when we had the conversation with my friends, my best friend told me, I've been wondering how to tell you this, and I've been wondering how to have this conversation with you, but you're like the most difficult person to read. You have walls which people can't penetrate, and you don't leave yourself vulnerable. So when people are around you, they feel a certain type of way. And that was a difficult thing to hear, because for the people in the room who are married or who have been in relationships, you know, it's not easy. It's not all roses. So you do have times when things are good. You have times when things are bad. But for me, the straw that broke the camel's back was when I felt betrayed by this person. And for 4 years, I walked around saying that my marriage failed because of what this other person had done. And going back to that place where I have to acknowledge that I had a part to play was a really difficult thing. I talk about it now, and it sounds very flippant when I say it. It's taken a really long time for me to be able to talk about it without breaking down or without welling up, or without just getting to the point where I say, this conversation is too hard, I'm not willing to have it. But it's taken me a long time to get here, and it's also taken a lot of taking responsibility for myself, taking responsibility for my actions, and taking responsibility for the things that I thought were strengths that actually ended up being limiting beliefs. Failure is important, not because, you know, it makes us immune to failing the next time, but because of what we learn from it. What does it tell us about ourselves? What does it tell us about how to tackle things in the future? So for me, my biggest failure, my marriage, tells me about how to be in a relationship in the future. It tells me that vulnerability is actually not a negative thing. It's not a thing to be afraid of. It's actually something to embrace. And this is the thing. Talking about something like this on a stage like this, for me, takes away something called shame. For those of us who are fans of Brené Brown, we talk about, she says that if you put shame in a petri dish and you douse it with secrecy, silence, and judgment, then it flourishes. But the minute I speak light into my story, and the minute I allow myself to shape my story and to tell my story, then that means I'm a little bit of a better person when I'm done with this conversation. Valentine, don't do that. It means I'm a little bit of a better person when I'm done with this conversation. And I think for me, that's my biggest takeaway. So Valentine asked me, are there gifts that come from failure? And I am going to say emphatically yes. So having a marriage breakdown is not one of those things that I would wish on anyone, not my worst enemy. But this is the one thing that I'm going to tell you. Once you get past that point where you cried yourself to sleep for 3 years, and then you wake up one day and you're not crying yourself to sleep, and you can go on, and then you go on and try other things that you know you might fail in, and you still persevere, and you get out the other side, the sun is shining, you're whole, everything in your body is working. Once you get past that point, you realize that there's nothing too difficult to go through. There's no lesson there's no lesson that can hold you down so much that you can't get up the next day and try again. And I guess for me, I'm back to realizing that I'm still a romantic, and I still do believe in relationships and in the institution of marriage, and that I guess I am going to try again at some point in the future. So that's my story. Thank you.